now have time for a lot of questions. So invite you, there's microphones up at the front of the room. Invite you to come up and ask questions of our speakers here. And if you don't have any, I'm sure I can come up with some too. So.
Good morning. Just like your legal opinion on this. Should a state that's challenging the rule take steps to implement the rule, or will that hurt their legal case?
Would you like me to take a first shot?
Both of you, from your perspective.
I have a conflict of interest. I want, I'm going to defend the plan. I think, as Dr. Hedman pointed out, there's nothing unique about a state that may have concerns about federal regulations, both challenging it in court and proceeding to comply. I think states that, and I know there has been talk of states taking a sort of, we're not going to cooperate at all approach. I think there are, and I would expect that regulated entities within their borders would say we're giving up a lot by not participating in the process. There are a lot of the very fact that this program gives so much choice to states means there are a lot of very important policy choices. If you don't win your legal challenge, we're stuck with either a suboptimal plan from our perspective, or maybe a federal plan if we can't get it. So it seems like it's taking quite a big risk, and I don't know that I understand the logic that it's not as if federal regulation of air pollution from large industrial sources is something that ought to be constitutionally suspect. I know there are arguments, but it seems to me questionable why a state would take that position, that even cooperating or doing anything, any part of the planning process, is somehow undermining the legal case.
And I would round that out. I agree with virtually everything that Sean had mentioned, and I also have clients that are taking different views as to whether or not states should or shouldn't submit a plan, and to my knowledge, our state has not made that decision yet. A couple things I would add, being kicked around right now, if a state were to submit a state implementation plan and ultimately the Clean Power Plan were reversed, vacated, it's viewed as difficult to unwind those state implementation plan approvals that EPA presumably would have granted by then. And I have to say, at least with respect to Region 5, I've had a lot of difficulty with that issue in a variety of different contexts. The new source review reforms took Region 5 multiple years to approve, even though it was a federal rule that Wisconsin was adopting unchanged. The ethanol rule was another one where we're still waiting for EPA to approve that. All we're doing is implementing a federal rule. I think there is some concern that if states were to go forward with that approach and it were approved by the EPA, it'd be difficult to unwind it. Another issue, this certainly is presenting itself in Wisconsin, I suspect in other states as well, is it takes a lot of work to put one of these plans together. Here in Wisconsin, on average, it takes 3 years to develop a rule. It's controversial right now as to whether Wisconsin even has to create a rule. I mean, that debate's going on, but I think the conclusion will be they need to. So given the deadlines that were discussed earlier by Dr. Hedman, we're going to have to get on that horse pretty quickly here in terms of rulemaking and making a decision as to what road we're going to go down really quickly. Put the EPA deadlines aside. We have our state ones to meet. And do we want to put all our resources into that effort before we know that this thing is going to survive, is the other argument that's out there. Clearly there are incentives. The Clean Energy Incentive Program that Dr. Hedman mentioned and Sean alluded to provides incentives for states to act early. There's a limited amount of those credits, as I understand it, that are out there. And those states that act early, I suspect, are going to get those credits. So I hope that helped.
Yes, I have a two-part question. First is the issue about companies that generally have to pay for their waste disposal. But to me, it seems like the energy or oil companies and utilities don't have to pay for the emissions that go into the air that have costs that they are not paying for. So help clarify that for me. Why is this industry special that it does not have to pay for its waste that ends up harming the environment and people? And speaking of people, I'm hearing a lot of discussion here about economics and not about lives. And according to the Massachusetts ruling, the reason we're doing this is because climate change affects public health. And while we are automatically becoming more energy efficient, and that's a nice progression, to the extent that the U.S. is only going into Paris with I don't know if it's the official is 28% or 32%, but let's say it's 32%. Most of the IPCC climatologists are saying, unless we reduce by 70%, we're not really solving the problem. So, those are the two questions I have. One is the why when we burn oil, whoever burns it doesn't have to pay for the cost. And secondly, why aren't we going further if in fact this emissions and pollution is all about public health and not about dollars saved?
Okay, I'll just assume that was directed to me. Let me start with that last point. I did acknowledge that, the ultimate goal here, as I understand it, is 70 to 80%. I think I did acknowledge that. And I acknowledged it in the context of that regulatory creep issue that I had mentioned earlier. I agree with you. That's where they want to be. But if that's where we want to be as a society, then let's have that dialogue. Let's talk about it and what that truly would look like. DOE did a study on what that would look like. I should have brought the statistics, but it's staggering the type of infrastructure that we would have to incur by 2050 if that truly is going to be our goal. And there is simply no way politically that this country is going to go down that road, would be my point on that. In terms of the social cost of carbon and the common good, I mean, that's the oldest policy academic debate out there, right, in terms of pollution. That in my mind goes back to, that's why we have Congress, that's why we have elected representatives. They have to weigh those competing interests and come up with some type of decision as to how are we going to allocate those things. We have a process to get that done. Keep in mind you're talking to a lawyer, and that's why I had concerns about the process, and I mentioned those as well. That type of argument should have been presented to Congress. In terms of people's health, CO2, I don't see a regulation, I don't see as being as directly linked to health as the criteria pollutants and hazardous air pollutants that are otherwise regulated under the Clean Air Act. That's part of the reason why I don't think that the Clean Air Act was designed for purposes of regulating CO2, notwithstanding what the courts have said. And there's another, angle to this debate, and this group knows that. I'm not here to necessarily defend it, but I think it needs to be presented. And that's that fossil fuels are largely attributed to increasing our standard of living here in this country and elsewhere. Many third world countries, as I understand it, part of the reason they're going to Paris and they're advocating their respective positions is they want to develop their economies more fully before they agree to these types of reductions. And in order to do that, I think they view fossil fuels as necessary to accomplish that. I know you're shaking your head. The thing that I also have to deal with quite often, and I was up in the northern part of the state earlier this week, the paper industry is just taking it on the chin right now. Very good paying jobs up there. They sustain people's, their families and the like. And, that should be considered part of the environment as well. We need to make sure that those people have employment, that we have a manufacturing sector in this country, and that people can make a living with that. Having these types of rules in place, yet people not having the ability to make a living, if you view their perspective on environment, that's not a trade-off that I think they're ready to make.
I mean, perhaps unsurprisingly, agree with the sort of premises of your first point, that carbon emissions cause harm to people now and perhaps especially to people in the future, and that we have to take that into account, and our whole society is gradually coming to that realization. And I think we will look back at a time where CO2 emissions were a free service provided to anyone who was able to emit them with alarm and surprise. So I completely agree with that, but it's obviously a very long and complex shift in view that's happening throughout all our many institutions. As far as this rule, I think, going back to Todd's point about environmental group criticism of this rule, I think I'm seeing pretty much the whole spectrum strongly supporting this rule, from Center for Biological Diversity to Sierra Club to EDF and NRDC and the other main national groups. So that's not inconsistent with thinking that, of course, this rule is an incremental step, and it's not, the answer to climate change. But as the Massachusetts case realized, it's not going to be, the solution to this problem is not going to look like a single, overarching program that handles the problem once and for all. It's going to be a process of incremental steps, and this is a very important one because it sends a signal to the largest emissions category. It builds on these trends that have started in motion without meaningful federal action through economics and through some state regulation. It builds on them and accentuates them, but it will require more. But I think the environmental community believes this is a tremendous achievement and positive step forward. The other thing I guess I would say is one often hears that, well, this program by itself is not going to reduce the temperature very much or retard sea level rise. And I guess, that too, the answer is this is a global problem, and what the solution to this problem looks like is a lot of small actions. A point made in Massachusetts, Joseph Stevens made that point as well. But if we think about a tiny, even a fraction of a millimeter of sea level rise in the entire Earth, like that's not enough. That's because it's a very, very big problem. A small slice of a very big problem still can reach large numbers in terms of value.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today and speaking. I think it's rare in today's very politicized climate to hear two sides of this debate in such a well-articulated and well-supported way. So I'd like to ask you two for some advice. It seems like in these debates, one side always says these regulations are crushing businesses, and the other side says we have to do this to save the world. Well, as a young person, those are two really big things, and when both of you have such well-articulated and well-supported arguments, it's hard to know how to negotiate what I think and feel on these issues. So I was wondering if you could comment and sort of provide some advice for people who might not have the expertise that you guys do. How do we take in your comments and feedback on these policies and then in turn figure out who to believe and who to support in terms of politics? Sorry.
I'll say first of all, about the politeness, I realize I'm in Wisconsin. When I do this kind of thing, like in New York, totally different persona, much more aggressive. There's a politeness thing that is just a regional requirement. It's difficult, but no, it's a great question. I think that so much of what passes for public discussion comes out of public relations shops and sort of is off the rack, and it was there before there were any facts to apply it to. And I think that's what you do is you figure out for yourself, and you read lots of people and figure out and through hard experience, I guess, and not take anyone's word completely for it for anything. I would say on this, the Chamber of Commerce just always says the same thing, and particularly with respect to the Clean Air Act, they've been wrong over and over, and they're really. I'm talking about the U.S. Chamber. I don't know if the Wisconsin branch is different, but it's just, and you know, I'm sure environmental groups have their own, there's sometimes a tendency to state things more categorically or alarmingly than should be, although I'm afraid climate change is not an example of that. So I guess I would dig down on this rule, the relationship or the reaction from the business world is going to be really complex, and you're going to see very big companies that believe that this kind of thing is not just tolerable but vital to our long-term. We can't have an economy that is relying on dirty energy because it will self-immolate eventually. So you'll see that, and then you'll make up your mind and probably get it more right than we have.
Yeah, great answer, and just a fantastic question, by the way. And I just want to revisit where I started this. I wanted to provide a perspective from different viewpoints, different folks that are approaching this rule. And if I gave the impression that this was wrong or we shouldn't be doing it, I wasn't necessarily saying that. I definitely have criticisms as to how it was done. I think it could have been done much better, and I suspect Sean would probably agree with that. If he were king, he would probably have created something a little different, and Dr. Hedman probably would have as well. But with that said, I don't think it's a red light, green light type of question or issue that's out there. I think generally speaking in the industrial sector, in the utility sector, you see a willingness to move on CO2 emissions. It's just this program may not be the best way to do it for the reasons that I talked about earlier. Should we blow this up altogether? As I mentioned earlier, it depends on from what perspective you're approaching this. So I'll leave it at that. I hope that helped.
Yes.
Okay.
More or less. Sort of the answer I expected.
All right.
Thank you.
Hi. I want to first say I really, really am enjoying this. I appreciate the legal perspective on both sides. Mr. Palmer, I really appreciated your list of all of our accomplishments so far. I really believe that, yeah, it's great. Is it going to get us to 80% at this rate? No. And unfortunately, what I see you doing, I see Mr. Donahue being an advocate, and I see you sort of fending off. And I know that's, you came here choosing that role. But what I would like to do is to speak not as a lawyer, but as a father, and speak as an advocate for what a vision you have. I look at what the woman who just asked the question was, how do you deal with the economy versus thing? And I know I don't view them as contradictory. I look at, for instance, the concern about the climate that's already, and how much it's stimulated our economy so far without any regulations at all, or without any policy at all, how much that just general concern has really stimulated all this research and all these upcoming innovations. You mentioned carbon capture and sequestration, but also innovations in solar and wind and other energy-free technologies. I know British Columbia has a carbon tax, a revenue-neutral carbon tax, and its economy is doing better than the rest of Canada, and their emissions have dropped significantly. Is that something you advocate, or I guess I'm asking you to step away from defending and advocate for something. If this isn't good, what do you want?
Well, and I don't want to avoid the question. First off, what do I think as a lawyer? Who cares? Or as a father, who cares? That's ad hominem. What I care about my kids is that they're employed, that they live happy lives, and that they stay in this country. And the reason I mention that is because my wife's not from this country. They have options to go elsewhere, and that's something that we do talk about. The manufacturing sector in this country is really hurting. I have to stress that to you all. And if you're not involved in that sector, you really need to pay more attention to it. And that's why I went out of my way to kind of present that today. I'll leave it at that. And then from me as a lawyer, I advocate what my clients ask me to advocate. And that's what I do. Carbon tax is certainly an issue that's out there. There's other ways to approach this problem. Go to Congress. Again, go and have the elected representative of our society make these decisions and have this debate. As a lawyer, that would be my response. I'm not here to say which one of those they choose, but I'm not sure it's appropriate to have the executive branch making these decisions all on their own, because you don't have that type of give and take. The types of issues that you raised a moment ago are very good, and sure, let's have a debate as a society as to which one we're going to pick. We started that debate, and it didn't go very far. Even with a Congress controlled by Democrats, if you're seeing this as a Democratic and a Republican issue. But if this is so important and everybody feels that strongly about it, then why do we not go back to Congress and have that debate and have a purposely created system to address these problems, like Canada, apparently, or other countries? So, Sean, I don't know if you want to add.
I would just say, on the going to Congress thing, environmental groups and people who care about addressing climate change, I think, tend to favor national legislation. There's good arguments for carbon tax, there are good arguments for cap and trade, other alternatives. We haven't gotten that yet. I don't think that means we don't do anything under existing authority. Ed Muskie and the Congresses that enacted and amended the Clean Air Act wrote it broadly so that when new dangers arose or were perceived, we had tools to deal with them. It's a very broad statute and a great achievement of our country. And the fact that we might, for example, this program is not economy-wide carbon regulation. It's not nearly of the reach of these bills that failed to pass. It's limited to one sector, an important sector, but it's a very different thing. So I think, in the absence of action from Congress, we should use the authorities that we have to address dangers that are really well documented now. And then when we get it together in our halls of Congress to do something more targeted that may be more updated or specific to the peculiarities of the climate problem, we'll do that. But I would certainly disagree with the proposition that we should just wait and not use existing authority that seems so clearly there.
And just to respond to that, and it's a very good point. I concede that the courts have determined that the Clean Air Act does regulate CO2 emissions, and EPA certainly played a role in that. They had some discretion in getting us there. But from that decision that they can regulate CO2 under the Clean Air Act to what we saw Dr. Hedman present, this very expansive BSER interpretation that focuses on the entire distribution system of our electric grid and imposes federal directives on states, that's a big leap in my mind. And I know Dr. Hedman described this rule as nothing more than vanilla Clean Air Act implementation. I respectfully disagree, and I think many other folks would as well.
So I'm going to apologize to those waiting to ask questions. I'm afraid we've run out of time for this session. We're going to have a break now for 15 minutes, and then we go into breakout sessions, so I encourage you to choose one of those. First, I'd like to thank our speakers. It's been very interesting to get these perspectives. Enjoy the rest of your day.